The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 1, continued, Cassette 5, Side 1. Amusements ranged from checkers and chess, backgammon and dice, to fishing and hunting, archery and jousts. Playing cards reached England toward the end of the 15th century. Today they still dress their kings and queens in the fashion of that time. Dancing and music were as popular as gambling. Nearly every Englishman took part in choral song. Henry V rivaled John Dunstable among the outstanding composers of the day. And English singers were acclaimed on the continent. Men played tennis, handball, football, bowls, quoits. They wrestled and boxed, set cocks to fighting, baited bears and bulls. Crowds gathered to see acrobats and rope-walkers perform the feats that amused antiquity and amazed modernity. Kings and nobles kept jugglers, jesters, and buffoons, and a lord of misrule, appointed by the king or queen, superintended the sports and revels of Christmastide. Women moved freely among men everywhere, drank in taverns, rode to the hounds, hunted with falcons, and distracted the spectators from the combatants at tournaments. It was they who, led by the queen, judged the jousters and awarded the golden crown. Travel was still travail, but nobody seemed to stay home, a bad mark for monogamy. Roads were mud or dust, and robbers made no distinction of race, sex, class, or creed. Inns were picturesque and dirty, stocked with roaches, rats, and fleas. Nearly every one of them had a dull tear-sheet for sale, and virtue could hardly find a bed. The poor went on foot, the well-to-do on horseback, usually in armed companies. The very rich used new-fangled horse-drawn coaches, reputedly invented by a 15th-century Hungarian in the village of Koch. Lordly carriages were carved and painted and gilded, cushioned and curtained and carpeted. Even so, they were less comfortable than camels, and as undulant as a fishing smack. Ships were no better than in antiquity, or worse. That which brought King John from Bordeaux to London in 1357 took 12 days. Crime flourished. Towns were too poor to have any but unpaid volunteer police, but all males were required to join in the hue and cry after a fleeing criminal. Deterrents were sought in severe penalties for the few who were caught. Burglary, larceny, arson, and sacrilege, as well as murder and treason, were punished with hanging on any convenient tree, and the corpse was left as a warning to others and a feast for crows. The practice of torture, both on the accused and on witnesses, developed under Edward IV and continued for 200 years. Lawyers abounded. Perhaps we judge the age too harshly, forgetting the barbarities of our enlightened century. Sir John Fortescue, Chief Justice under Henry VI, thought more highly of his time, and wrote in its honor 2 works once renowned. In a dialogue, De Laudibus Legum Angliae, he praised the laws of England, gloried in the right of trial by jury, mourned the use of torture, and, like 1,000 philosophers, warned princes to make themselves the law-abiding servants of the people. In Monarchia, or Governance of England, he compared France and England patriotically. In France, men could be condemned without public trial, the States General was rarely called, the king levied taxes on necessities like salt and wine. After so exalting his country, Sir John concluded that all governments should be subject to the Pope, usque ad pedum oscula, even to kissing his feet. 4. The Lollards. Archbishop Arundel in 1407 reaffirmed the supremacy of canon or ecclesiastical law over all secular legislation, and condemned as a major heresy any rejection of a papal decree. Recovering from Wycliffe, the Church grew stronger in 15th-century England, and rising wealth overflowed into its coffers. Chantries were now a frequent form of contribution. Persons expecting death paid for the building of a chapel and for the chanting of masses to expedite their souls into paradise. As some 20 bishops and 26 abbots sat in the House of Lords with only 47 laymen, the Church controlled the major chamber of Parliament. To offset this, Henry VII, and later Henry VIII, insisted on the right of the kings to nominate the bishops and abbots of England from the eligible clergy, and this dependence of the hierarchy on the monarchy eased the clerical surrender to Henry VIII's assertion of royal supremacy over the English Church. Meanwhile, Wycliffe's poor preachers continued to spread their anti-clerical ideas. As early as 1382, a monastic chronicler reported, with frightened exaggeration, that they multiplied exceedingly like budding plants, and filled the whole realm. You could scarce meet two men on the road but that one of them was a disciple of Wycliffe. They found their readiest audience among the industrial workers, especially the weavers of Norfolk. In 1395, the Lollards felt strong enough to present to Parliament a bold statement of their principles. They opposed clerical celibacy, transubstantiation, image worship, pilgrimages, prayers for the dead, the wealth and endowment of the Church, the employment of ecclesiastics in state offices, the necessity of confession to priests, the ceremonies of exorcism, and the worship of the saints. In other pronouncements, they recommended that all should read the Bible frequently and should follow its precepts as superior to the decrees of the Church. They denounced war as unchristian and luxury as immoral. They called for sumptuary laws that would compel a return to simple foods and dress. They abhorred oaths and substituted for them such phrases as, "I am sure," or "it is sooth," that is, truth. Already the Puritan mind and view were taking form in Britain. A few preachers mingled socialism with their religion, but most of them refrained from attacking private property and sought the support of knights and gentry as well as of peasants and prolétaires. Nevertheless, the upper classes could not forget their narrow escape from social revolution in 1381, and the Church found in them a new readiness to protect her as a stabilizing force in the community. Richard II threatened with arrest the representatives of the Lollards in Parliament and reduced them to silence. In 1397, the English bishops petitioned the king for the execution of impenitent heretics, as in other realms subject to the Christian religion, but Richard was loath to go to such lengths. In 1401, however, Henry IV and his Parliament issued the famous statute De Haeretico Comburendo. All persons declared by an ecclesiastical court to be persistent heretics were to be burned, and all heretical books were to be destroyed. In that same year, William Sawtry, a Lollard priest, was burned at the stake. Other Lollards were arrested, recanted, and were treated leniently. In 1406, the Prince of Wales presented to Henry IV a petition alleging that the propaganda of the Lollards and their attacks on monastic property threatened the whole existing fabric of society. The king ordered a more vigorous prosecution of the heretics, but the absorption of the bishops in the politics of the papal schism temporarily deflected their energy from the hunt. In 1410, John Badby, a Lollard tailor, was condemned by the Church and was burned in Smithfield Market. Before the faggots were lighted, Prince Hal pleaded with Badby to recant and offered him life and money. Badby refused and mounted the pyre to his death. The prince came to the throne in 1413 as Henry V and gave his full support to the policy of suppression. One of his personal friends was Sir John Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, whom some of Shakespeare's audience later identified with Falstaff. Oldcastle had served the nation well in the field, but he tolerated and protected Lollard preachers on his lands in Herefordshire and Kent. Thrice the bishops summoned him to trial. Thrice he refused to come. He yielded, however, to a writ from the king and appeared before the bishops in 1413 in that chapter house of St. Paul's where Wycliffe had stood trial 36 years before. He affirmed his sincere Christianity, but would not reject the Lollard views on confession or the Eucharist. He was condemned as a heretic and was confined in the Tower of London. 40 days' grace was allowed him in the hope that he would recant. Instead, he escaped. At the news, the Lollards around London rose in revolt and tried to seize the king in 1414. The attempt failed, and some leaders were caught and hanged. Oldcastle hid for 3 years in the mountains of Herefordshire and Wales. Finally, he was captured, hanged as a traitor, and then burned as a heretic in 1417. State and Church, both demanding their due. As compared with other persecutions, that of Lollardry was almost moderate. The executions for heresy numbered 11 between 1400 and 1485. We hear of several Lollard congregations surviving till 1521. As late as 1518, Thomas Mann, who claimed to have converted 700 to Lollardry, suffered death at the stake, and 6 more were burned in 1521. When Henry VIII divorced England from Rome, and the nation accepted the change without revolution, the Lollards might have claimed that in some measure they had prepared the way. In 1450, Reginald Peacock, Bishop of Chichester, published a book which he called, in the whimsical fashion of the times, Repressor of Overmuch Blaming of the Clergy. It was avowedly a refutation of lollardry, and assumed a vigorous anti-clericalism among the people. It proposed to check these ideas not by imprisonment at the stake, but solely by an appeal to reason. The enthusiastic bishop reasoned so much that he fell in love with reason and in danger of heresy. He found himself refuting by reason some Lollard arguments from Scripture. In a treatise on faith, he definitely placed reason above the Bible as a test of truth, a position that Europe would take 200 years to regain. For good measure, the irrepressible repressor added that the fathers of the Church were not always to be trusted, that Aristotle was not an unquestionable authority, that the apostles had had no hand in the Apostles' Creed, and that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. The English bishops hailed the proud Peacock before their court in 1457 and gave him a choice between recanting or burning. He disliked burning, read a public abjuration, was deposed from his see, and was segregated in Thorney Abbey to the end of his days in 1460. 5. English Art, 1300 to 1509. Despite anti-clericalism and heresy, religion was still sufficiently fervent and opulent to raise English literature to a minor peak of excellence. The growth of commerce and the spoils of war financed cathedrals, castles, and palaces, and glorified Oxford and Cambridge with the fairest homes ever built for learning. From the marble of Purbeck and the alabaster of Nottingham, to the forests of Sherwood and the brick of any shire, the building materials of England were transformed into noble towers and lordly spires, and wooden ceilings almost as strong and handsome as Gothic stone vaults. The ugly tie-beam that had crossed obtrusively from wall to wall was replaced by hammer-beam projections, supporting with massive shoulders of oak the soaring arch above. In this manner some of England's finest churches spanned their naves. So Selby Cathedral received an oak ceiling of ribs and bosses, rivaling the Learn and Fan designs that vaulted the Abbey Church at Bath, the choir at Ely, and the south transept of Gloucester with complex webs of stone. Patterns in window tracery, wall paneling, and choir screens gave their names to successive architectural styles, overlapping in time and often mingled in one edifice. Geometrical decorated Gothic, circa 1250 to circa 1315, used Euclidean forms, as in Exeter Cathedral. Curvilinear decorated Gothic, circa 1315 to circa 1380, abandoned definite figures for freely flowing lines that anticipated with restraint the flamboyant style of France, as in the South Rose window at Lincoln. Perpendicular Gothic, circa 1330 to circa 1530, stressed horizontal and vertical lines within the usual Gothic ogive, as in Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. The intense colors of 13th century stained glass were now softened with lighter tints, or with silver stain or pale grisaille. And in these windows the pageant of dying chivalry competed with the legends of Christianity to let Gothic art reach its final splendor and decline. Seldom has England known such an ecstasy of construction. 3 centuries, from 1376 to 1517, labored to build the present nave of Westminster Abbey. In the long gamut of those years we may weakly sense the toil of mind and arm that went to make an unrivaled mausoleum for England's best-behaved geniuses. Only less impressive was the reconstruction of Windsor. There Edward III rebuilt on a massive scale the great round tower in 1344, and Edward IV began in 1473 St. George's Chapel, with its lovely choir stalls, fan vault, and stained glass. Alan de Walsingham designed in curvilinear Gothic an exquisite Lady Chapel and Lantern Tower for Ely. Gloucester Cathedral received a central tower, a choir vault, a gorgeous east window, and spacious cloisters whose fan vaults are among the wonders of England. Winchester extended its immense nave and dressed its new front in perpendicular. Coventry built in that manner the cathedral that saved only its stately spire in the Second World War. Peterborough raised its dizzy fan vault. York Minster completed its nave, west towers, and choir screen. towers were the crowning glory of the age, ennobling Merton and Magdalen colleges at Oxford, Fountains Abbey, Canterbury, Glastonbury, Derby, Taunton, and 100 other shrines. William of Wykeham used perpendicular in designing New College, Oxford. William of Waynflete, another nonagenarian, followed suit in the Great Quadrangle at Eton. And King's College, Cambridge, capped the age with a chapel, whose windows, vault, and choir stalls might reconcile Caliban to education and Timon of Athens to prayer. There was a secular and matter-of-fact spirit in Perpendicular Gothic that perfectly suited the civic architecture of colleges, castles, fortresses, guild, and city halls. It was in this style that the Earls of Warwick, in the 14th and 15th centuries, raised their famous castle near Leamington. The Guildhall of London, fane of the capital's mercantile pride, was built in 1411 to 1435, burned down in 1666, was rebuilt by Christopher Wren, and received in 1866 the new interior that succumbed to bombs in the Second World War. Even the town shops took on, in their mullioned windows, a perpendicular pattern that conspires with carved lintels, cornices, and projecting balconies to bewitch us with the charm of a departing glory. English sculpture maintained in this age its reputation for mediocrity. The statuary made for church facades, as at Lincoln and Exeter, fell far short of the architecture it was intended to adorn. The great altar screens in Westminster Cathedral and St. Albans Abbey served as matrices for statues, but these are of too modest merit to add to the burden of our tale. The best sculpture was on funerary monuments. Fine figures were carved, usually in alabaster, of Edward II in Gloucester Cathedral, of Dame Eleanor Percy in Beverley Minster, of Henry IV and Queen Joan at Canterbury, of Richard Beauchamp at Warwick. English sculptors were at their best in representing the flowers and foliage of their verdant land. Good carving was done on wood. The choir stalls of Winchester, Ely, Gloucester, Lincoln, Norwich stopped the breath with their laborious beauty. Painting was still a minor art in England, lagging far behind contemporary work in Flanders and France. Illumination remained a favorite devotion. Edward III paid £66, or about $6,600 today, for an illuminated volume of romances. And Robert of Ormsby presented to Norwich Cathedral an illuminated psalter which the Bodleian Library ranks as the finest English manuscript in its collections. After 1450, the art of the miniature declined with the rise of mural and panel painting, and in the 16th century it faded out before the novel miracle of print. 6. Caxton and Malory. At some unknown date in the 15th century, a now nameless author produced the most famous of English morality plays. Every Man is an allegory whose characters are unprepossessing abstractions: knowledge, beauty, 5 wits, discretion, strength, goods, good deeds, fellowship, kindred, confession, death, every man, and God. In the prologue, God complains that his commandments are ignored by 9 men out of 10, 6 days out of 7, and sends death to remind the terrestrials that they must soon come to him and give an account of their doings. In the space of a line, death descends from heaven to earth, finds every man meditating earnestly on women and gold, and bids him come into eternity. Every man pleads unpreparedness, asks for an extension of time, offers a £1,000 bribe. But death grants him only one mitigation: to be accompanied into eternity by some chosen friend. Every man begs fellowship to join him in the great adventure, but fellowship excuses himself bravely. If thou wilt eat and drink and make good cheer, or haunt together women's lusty company, I would not forsake you. Every man: then bear me company in my far journey. Fellowship: now in good faith I will not that way, but if thou wilt murder or any man kill, in that I will help thee with a good will. Every man appeals to kindred, his cousin, who rejects the invitation because I have the cramp in my toe. Every man calls upon Goods to aid him, but Goods has been so firmly locked away that he cannot be freed to render any help. At last every man entreats Good Deeds. She is pleased that he has not quite forgotten her. She introduces him to Knowledge, who leads him to Confession, who shrives him clean. Then Good Deeds descends with every man into his grave, and angelic songs welcome the purified sinner into paradise. The author almost but not quite triumphed over an ungainly dramatic form. The personification of a quality can never qualify as a person, for every man is an irritatingly complex contradiction, unique except when part of a crowd. And great art must portray the general through the unique, as through Hamlet or Quixote, Oedipus or Panurge. Experiment and ingenuity would need another century to transform the dull morality play into the living Elizabethan drama of infinitely variable man. The great literary event in 15th century England was the establishment of its first printing press. Born in Kent, William Caxton migrated to Bruges as a merchant. In his leisure, he translated a collection of French romances. His friends asked for copies, which he made himself, but his hand, he tells us, became weary and not steadfast with much writing, and his eyes were dimmed with overmuch looking on the white paper. On his visits to Cologne, he may have seen the printing press set up there in 1466 by Ulrich Zell, who had learned the new technique in Mainz. In 1471, Collard Mansion organized a printing shop in Bruges, and Caxton resorted to it as a means of multiplying copies of his translation. In 1476 he returned to England, and a year later he installed at Westminster the fonts, perhaps the presses, that he had brought from Bruges. He was already 55, and only 15 years were left him. But in that period he printed 98 books, several of them translated by himself from the Latin or the French. His choice of titles, and the quaint and charming style of his prefaces, laid a lasting mark on English literature. When he died in 1491, his Alsatian associate, Wynkyn de Voorde, carried on the revolution. In 1485, Caxton edited and published one of the most lovable masterpieces of English prose, the noble histories of King Arthur and of certain of his knights. Its strange author had died, probably in prison, some 16 years before. Sir Thomas Malory, in the 100 Years' War, served in the retinue of Richard de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and represented Warwick in the Parliament of 1445. Lonesome for the license of war, he broke into the home of Hugh Smythe, raped Hugh's wife, extorted 100 shillings from Margaret King and William Hales, broke again into Hugh Smythe's house, and again raped the wife. He stole 7 cows, 2 calves, and 335 sheep, twice looted the Cistercian abbey at Coombe, and was twice clapped into jail. It seems incredible that such a man should have written that tender swan song of English chivalry which we now call Le Morte d'Arthur. But after a century of dispute, it is agreed that these delightful romances were the product of Sir Thomas Malory's incarcerated years. He took most of the stories from the French forms of the Arthurian legends, arranged them in tolerable sequence, and phrased them in a style of wistful feminine charm. To an aristocracy losing chivalry and the brutalities and treacheries of war, he appealed for a return to the high standards of Arthur's knights, forgetting their transgressions and his own. Arthur, after outgrowing fornication and incest, settles down with his pretty but venturesome Guinevere, governs England, indeed all Europe, from his capital at Camelot, Winchester, and requires the 150 knights of his Round Table to pledge themselves never to do outrage nor murder, by no means to be cruel, but to give mercy unto him that asketh mercy, and always to do gentlewomen succor upon pain of death. Love and war are the mingled themes of a book resounding with the combats of incomparable chevaliers for dames and damosels beyond compare. Tristram and Lancelot cuckold their kings, but are the soul of honor and bravery. Encountering each other armored, helmeted, and visored, and hence with their identities concealed, they fight for 4 hours, until their swords are incarnadined and dull. Then at last spake Sir Lancelot, and said, Knight, thou fightest wonderly well as ever I saw knight. Therefore, an it please you, tell me your name. Sir, said Sir Tristram, that is me loath to tell any man my name. Truly, said Sir Lancelot, an I were required, I was never loath to tell my name. It is well said, Sir Tristram, therefore I require you to tell me your name. Fair knight, he said, my name is Sir Lancelot du Lac. Alas, said Sir Tristram, what have I done? For ye are the man in the world that I love best. Fair knight, said Sir Lancelot, tell me your name. Truly, he said, my name is Sir Tristram de Lyon. "O Jesu," said Sir Launcelot, "what adventure has befallen me?" And therewith Sir Launcelot kneeled down and yielded him up his sword. And therewith Sir Tristram kneeled down and yielded him up his sword. Then they both forthwith went to the stone, and set them down upon it, and took off their helms, and either kissed other 100 times. What a leap it is from this airy realm, in which no one ever worked for a living, and all women were gentlewomen, to the real matter-of-fact world of the Paston letters, those living missives that bound a scattered family together in affection and finance in the England of the 15th century. Here is John Paston, who practices law in London or on circuit, while Margaret rears their children and manages his property at Norwich. He is all business, stern, stingy, competent. She is all submission, a humble, able, timid wife, who trembles at the thought that she has offended him. Such were the Guineveres of the actual world. Yet here, too, are delicate sentiments, mutual solicitude, even romance. Marjorie Brews confesses to Sir John Paston II that she loves him, and mourns that the dowry she can bring him falls far below his state. "But if ye love me, as I trust verily ye do, ye will not leave me therefore." And he, master of the Paston fortune, marries her despite the complaints of his relatives, and himself dies within 2 years. There were hearts tender and bruised under the hard surface of that disordered age. 7. The English Humanists. We must not wonder that the exuberance of classical scholarship in the Italy of Cosimo and Lorenzo de' Medici awoke only a timid echo in an England whose merchants cared little for letters, and whose nobles were not ashamed of illiterate wealth. Sir Thomas More, at the outset of the 16th century, reckoned that some 40% of the English people could read. The Church and the universities which she controlled were as yet the sole patrons of scholars. It is to the credit of England that, under these circumstances, and amid the waste and violence of war, men like Grocyn, Linacre, Latimer, and Colet were touched by the Italian fire, and brought enough of its heat and light to England to make Erasmus, Europe's arbiter literarum, feel at home when he came to the island in 1499. The humanists, devoted to the study of pagan as well as Christian culture, were denounced by a few ingrown Trojans, who feared these Greeks bringing gifts from Italy, but they were bravely defended and befriended by great churchmen like William of Waynflete, Bishop of Winchester, William Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and later Thomas Cardinal Wolsey, Chancellor of England. From the time when Manuel Chrysoloras visited England in 1408, some young English scholars caught a fever, whose only cure, they felt, was study or lechery in Italy. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, came back from Italy with a passion for manuscripts, and collected a library that afterward enriched the Bodleian. John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, studied under Guarino de Verona at Ferrara and John Argyropoulos at Florence, and returned to England with more books than morals. In 1464-67, the monk William Tilly of Selling studied at Padua, Bologna, and Rome, brought back many pagan classics, and taught Greek at Canterbury. One of his fervent pupils there was Thomas Linacre. When Tilly went again to Italy in 1487, Linacre accompanied him, and remained 12 years. He studied under Politian and Chalcondyles in Florence, edited Greek works for Aldus Manutius in Venice, and returned to England so accomplished in diverse fields of learning that Henry VII summoned him to tutor Arthur, Prince of Wales. At Oxford he and Grocyn and Latimer constituted almost an Oxford movement toward the classic languages and literatures. Their lectures inspired John Colet and Thomas More, and attracted Erasmus himself. Linacre was the most universal of the English humanists, at home in Greek and Latin, translating Galen, promoting scientific medicine, founding the Royal College of Physicians, and leaving his fortune to endow chairs of medicine at Oxford and Cambridge. Through him, said Erasmus, the new learning was so established in Britain that no Englishman need any longer go to study in Italy. William Grocyn was already 40 when he joined Linacre in Florence. Returning to England in 1492, he hired rooms in Exeter College, Oxford, and lectured daily on Greek, over the protests of conservatives who trembled lest the original text of the New Testament should upset the 1,000-year-old authority of Jerome's Vulgate Latin translation. But Grocyn was reassuringly orthodox in doctrine and rigidly upright in his moral life. English humanism never developed, as in some scholars of the Italian Renaissance, even a concealed hostility to Christianity. It treasured the Christian heritage above all intellectual refinements, and its most famous disciple found no embarrassment in being Dean of St. Paul's. John Colet was the eldest son of Sir Henry Colet, a rich merchant who begot 22 children and served 2 terms as mayor of London. At Oxford the youth caught the humanist fervor from Linacre and Engrossing, and eagerly devoured Plato, Plotinus, and Cicero. In 1493 he travelled in France and Italy, met Erasmus and Boudet in Paris, was strongly moved by Savonarola in Florence, and was shocked by the levity and license of cardinals and Alexander VI in Rome. On his return to England, having inherited his father's wealth, he might have risen to high place in business or politics, but he preferred scholastic life in Oxford. Ignoring the tradition that only a priest might teach theology, he lectured on St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. He replaced scholastic dialectic with criticism and elucidation of the Vulgate text, and his large audiences felt refreshed by the novelty of his method and by his stress on the good life as the best theology. Erasmus, who saw him at Oxford in 1499, described him as a saint perpetually tempted to lust and luxury, but keeping the flower of his virginity till his death, scorning the easy-going monks of his time and dedicating his fortune to pious uses and charity. He was a loyal opposition in the Church, loving her despite her faults. He questioned the literal truth of Genesis, but accepted the divine inspiration of the Bible. He foreshadowed the Reformers in stressing the authority of the Scriptures as against ecclesiastical traditions and forms, in rejecting the scholastic philosophy as an intellectual dilution of simple Christianity, in doubting the confessional powers of priests and the real presence of Christ in the consecrated bread, and in denouncing the worldliness of the clergy. If the highest bishop, whom we call the Pope, be a lawful bishop, he of himself does nothing but God in him. But if he do attempt anything of himself, he is then a breeder of poison. This has now indeed been done for many years past, and has by this time so increased as to take powerful hold on all members of the Christian Church, so that unless Jesus lay to his hand with all speed, our most disordered Church cannot be far from death. Oh, the abominable impiety of those miserable priests, of whom this age contains a great multitude, who fear not to rush from the bosom of some foul harlot into the temple of the Church, to the altars of Christ, to the mysteries of God. On them the vengeance of God will one day fall. In 1504 Colet was appointed Dean of St. Paul's. From that high pulpit he preached against the sale of bishoprics and the evil of plural benefices held by one man. He aroused an angry opposition, but Archbishop Warham protected him. Linacre, Grocyn, and More were now established in London, free from the conservatism and scholasticism of Oxford, stimulated by the visits of Erasmus, and soon to enjoy the support of the young Henry VIII. Everything seemed prepared for an English Renaissance that would move hand in hand with a peaceful Reformation. Chapter 6. Episode in Burgundy, 1363 to 1515. 1. The Royal Dukes. By its position on the eastern flank of France around Dijon, and by the subtle statesmanship of its dukes, Burgundy emerged with little harm from the 100 Years' War, and became for half a century the brightest spot in Transalpine Christendom. When the Burgundian ducal family of the Capetian line became extinct, and the duchy reverted to the French crown, John II gave it to his fourth son Philip in 1363 as a reward for valor at Poitiers. During his 41 years as Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, or Philippe le Hardi, managed so well and married so diplomatically that Hainaut, Flanders, Artois, and Franche-Comté came under his rule. And the Duchy of Burgundy, technically a province of France, became in effect an independent state, enriched by Flemish commerce and industry, and graced by the patronage of art. John the Fearless, Jean Sans Peur, by a fine web of alliances and intrigues, stretched his power to the bursting point, and France felt challenged to resist. Louis, Duke of Orleans, ruling France for his mad brother Charles VI, allied France with the Holy Roman Empire in a plan to check the unwisely fearless Duke. John's hired assassins killed him, violent strife ensued between the Burgundian party and the Armagnacs, followers of Louis's father-in-law, the Count of Armagnac, for the control of French policy, and John in turn died under an assassin's knife in 1419. His son Philip the Good renounced all feudal allegiance to France, allied Burgundy with England, and annexed Tournai, Namur, Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, Limburg, and Louvain. When he made his peace with France in 1435, he exacted the recognition of his duchy's practical sovereignty and the cession of Luxembourg, Liège, Cambrai, and Utrecht. Burgundy was now at its zenith, rivaling in wealth and power any kingdom in the West. Philip might not win from tender minds his title, the Good. He was not above chicanery and cruelty and unmannerly flares of wrath. But he was a devoted son, an excellent administrator, and a fond father even to his 16 illegitimate offspring. He loved women royally, had 24 mistresses, prayed and fasted, gave alms, and made his capitals, Dijon, Bruges, and Ghent, the art foci of the Western world outside of Italy. His long rule brought to Burgundy and its provinces such affluence that few of his subjects made any fuss about his sins. The Flemish towns fretted under his mastery and mourned to see their old guild organization and communal liberties yielding to a national economy under a centralized government. Philip and his son Charles suppressed their revolts, but allowed them a conciliatory peace, for they knew that from the industry and commerce of these cities came the richest ducal revenues. Before Philip, the regions of the Lower Rhine had been fragments, as diverse in institutions and policies as in race and speech. He bound them into a unified state, gave them order, and seconded their prosperity. Burgundian society at Bruges, Ghent, Liège, Louvain, Brussels, and Dijon was now, from 1420 to 1460, the most polished and amorous in Europe, not excepting the contemporary Florence of Cosimo de' Medici. The dukes preserved all the forms of chivalry. It was Philip the Good who founded the Order of the Golden Fleece in 1429, and it was in part from her Burgundian allies that England took the chivalric pomp and glamour that brightened the rough surface of English manners, glorified the campaigns of Henry V, and shone in the pages of Froissart and Malory. The Burgundian nobles, shorn of independent power, lived chiefly as courtiers, and developed all the graces of dress and bearing that could adorn parasitism and adultery. Merchants and manufacturers robed themselves like royalty, and fed and gowned their wives as if preparing the scene for Rubens. Under so loving a duke, monogamy would have been lèse majesté. John of Heinsberg, the jolly Bishop of Liège, spawned a dozen bastards. John of Burgundy, Bishop of Cambrai, had 36 children and grandchildren begotten out of wedlock. Many of the elite in this eugenic age were so born. Prostitutes could be found at almost any time and price at the public baths. At Louvain they pretended to be landladies, offering accommodations for students. Festivals were many and extravagant. Famous artists were engaged to design the pageants and decorate the floats, and people came over frontiers and seas to view gorgeous spectacles in which nude women played the part of ancient goddesses and nymphs. 2. The religious spirit. In somber contrast with this effervescent society were the saints and mystics who, under these dukes, gave Holland a high place in religious history. Jan van Ruysbroek, a Brussels priest, retired at 50 in 1343 to an Augustinian monastery at Groenendael, near Waterloo, where he devoted himself to mystical contemplation and compositions. He professed that the Holy Spirit guided his pen. Nevertheless, his pantheism verged upon a denial of individual immortality. God himself is swallowed up with all the blessed in an absence of modes, an eternal loss of self. The 7th degree is attained when, beyond all knowledge or all knowing, we discover in ourselves a bottomless not-knowing. When, beyond all names given to God or to creatures, we come to expire and pass over in eternal namelessness, where we lose ourselves, and contemplate all these blessed spirits which are essentially sunken away, merged and lost in their superessence, in an unknown darkness without mode. The Netherlands and Rhenish Germany saw in this period a profusion of lay groups, Beguards, Beguines, brethren of the free spirit, whose mystic raptures led often to piety, social service, quietism and pacifism, sometimes to a rejection of the sacraments as unnecessary, and occasionally to a cheerful acceptance of sin as quite swallowed up in union with God. Gerrit Groot of Deventer, after receiving a good education at Cologne, Paris, and Prague, spent many days with Ruysbroek at Grunendahl, and was moved to make the love of God the pervading motive of his life. Having received deacon's orders in 1379, he began to preach in the towns of Holland, in the vernacular, to audiences so large that the local churches could not hold them. People left their shops and meals to hear him. Scrupulously orthodox in doctrine, and himself a hammer of heretics, he nevertheless attacked the moral laxity of priests as well as of laymen, and demanded that Christians should live strictly in accord with the ethics of Christ. He was denounced as a heretic, and the Bishop of Utrecht withdrew from all deacons the right to preach. One of Groot's followers, Floris Radowijnszoon, drew up a semi-monastic, semi-communistic rule for the Brethren of the Common Life, who lived in a frater house at Deventer with Groot at their head, and, without taking monastic vows, occupied themselves with manual labor, teaching, religious devotions, and copying manuscripts. Groot died at 44 in 1384 of a pestilence contracted while nursing a friend, but his brotherhood spread its influence through 200 fraterhausen in Holland and Germany. The schools of the Brotherhood gave the pagan classics a prominent place in their curriculum, preparing the way for the Jesuit schools that took over their work in the Counter-Reformation. The Brethren welcomed printing soon after its appearance, and used it to disseminate their Moderna Devotio. Alexander Hagius, at Deventer, 1475 to 1498, was a memorable example of the type that fortunate students have known, the saintly teacher who lives only for the instruction and moral guidance of his pupils. He improved the curriculum, centered it around the classics, and won the praise of Erasmus for the purity of his Latin style. When he died, he left nothing but his clothes and his books. Everything else he had secretly given to the poor. Among the famous pupils of Deventer were Nicholas of Cusa, Erasmus, Rudolf Agricola, Jean de Gerson, and the author of The Imitation of Christ. We are not sure who wrote this exquisite manual of humility. Probably it was Thomas Hammerken of Kempen in Prussia. In the quiet of his cell in the monastery of Mount St. Agnes near Zwolle, Thomas à Kempis, 1380 to 1471, gathered from the Bible, the Fathers of the Church, and St. Bernard, passages expounding the ideal of unworldly piety as conceived by Ruysbroek and Groot, and rephrased them in simple mellifluous Latin. What will it avail thee to be engaged in profound discussions of the Trinity, if thou be void of humility, and art thereby displeasing to the Trinity? Truly, sublime words do not make a man holy and just, but a virtuous life maketh him dear to God. I had rather feel compunction than know how to define it. If thou knewest the whole Bible by heart, and the sayings of all the philosophers, what would it profit thee without the love of God, and without grace? Vanity of vanities, and all is vanity, except to love God, and him only to serve. This is the highest wisdom, by contempt of the world to tend toward the kingdom of heaven. Yet learning is not to be blamed, for that is good in itself, and ordained by God. But a good conscience and a virtuous life are always to be preferred. He is truly great who hath great love. He is truly great that is little in his own eyes, and that maketh no account of any height of honor. He is truly wise who casteth aside all earthly things as dung, that he may win Christ. Fly the tumult of men as much as thou canst, for the treating of worldly affairs is a great hindrance. Truly it is misery to live on the earth. It is a great matter to live in obedience, to be under a superior, and not to be at our own disposing. It is much safer to obey than to govern. The cell, constantly dwelt in, groweth sweet. There is a gentle eloquence in the Imitation that echoes the profound simplicity of Christ's sermons and parables. It is an ever-needed check on the intellectual pride of frail reason and shallow sophistication. When we are weary of facing our responsibilities in life, we shall find no better refuge than Thomas à Kempis's Fifth Gospel. But who shall teach us how to be Christians in the stream and storm of the world? 3. Sparkling Burgundy, 1363 to 1465. Despite such deprecating Thomases, the provinces under Burgundian rule indulged in considerable intellectual activity. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.